All right, so in this section, we're going to take a look at the expectation and variance of random variable. So we're going to look at the expectation and variance of random variables. It's important to note that what's actually happening here is we're trying to figure out where the center and where the spread is of these variables. So if we look at it, I did take the pre-drawing. -3 to 2 are the possible things that could happen. And, maybe it's betting. So maybe it's like you're sitting on the street and you could pay $1, and if, you win, you make $2, but if you lose, you lose $3. And these are the probabilities of those happening. So the probability of -3 happens 25% of the time, -2 happens 15, -1 happens 5% of the time, 0 happens 30, 1 happens 20% of the time, and 2 happens 5% of the time. And so one of the things we want to remember is that when we're talking about probability, we have outcomes that could happen, which is what these numbers are, and we have the likelihood of those outcomes, which is what the probabilities are. Each probability has to be between 0 and 1 because there's no such thing as negative probability, and there's no way of getting greater than 100%. And when you take each of these independently and add them up, they should add up to 1. And then what we're trying to find is on average, how far are we from them, or where is the center? And then how much variability is there. So we're not even looking at standard deviation, we're just looking at variance. So if you look in the textbook, or if you follow what it says here, the mean of a probability that looks like this is very easily found. And an easy is really not a nice word, right? Easy is that if you give me 3 tests, I can add them up and divide by 3. But if I have 300 tests, I'm going to make a mistake when I add those up to go to divide by 300. If I had 3,000, it's going to get worse. And so what happens is sometimes there's only a couple of outcomes. So like when players get up to bat, they might get up 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 times. We can, instead of adding up every time they get up to bat over 20 years, we can take the probability that they get 0 hits, the probability that they get 1 hit, the probability that they get 2 hits. And to get the mean, what we would do is we would add up, so that's what the capital sigma stands for, I know it looks ugly, each outcome multiplied by the probability of that outcome. Now, because of please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, we would multiply first, and then after we multiply them together, we would take the mean. So what we want to do, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take an Excel file, and I'm going to recreate this distribution here. So I'm going to do X, and I'm going to do the probability of X. And so the possibilities for X to take on values of are -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. And the likelihood that they're going to occur is 25%, 15%, 5%, 30%, 20%, and 5%. So those are the outcomes. So when we look at them, you can only assess the textbook after you finish the exam. So the exam, you can use YouTube. You can use the videos if you can gauge which ones are on there, but during the assessment, the textbook is not open. So to get the expectation, which is the mean, what you do is you take each outcome, you multiply it by the probability that outcome occurs, and you sum it. So that's what the formula that you'll see when you look at this is. It's you take each X, you multiply it by the probability of X, and then you sum them up. So when we look at it, I'm going to move my chat function to the other screen. So in this case, when we look at the Excel, did I just switch my, you guys can still see. When we look at the Excel, what we're going to do is we're going to put in each X, the probability of X, and all we simply want to do is take each X and multiply it by the probability that that X occurs. And so to do that, we would do equals this number times this number, because this X is -3, and the probability that -3 occurs is 25% of the time. And then we can do that each time, or we can drag it down. And we can see that this is going to be equal to the 2 times the probability, the -2 times the probability that the -2 occurs. The next one's going to be -1 times the probability that the -1 occurs. The 0 multiplied by the probability 0 occurs, the 1 times the probability of 1, and the 2 times the probability of 0.05. The ALEKS textbook is just the explain function. It'll give you the pages in the textbook that would match with the topic that you're working on. So if you're not sure how to do this and this doesn't help, you would hit the explain function, which we can take a look at in a second. So if I want to get the expected value, or to figure out what the expected value is, we take the x times the probability of x, and then we simply sum them up. So the expected value is -0.8. Now the formula for the variance is a little scarier looking, but it's not actually much more complicated. So in order to get the variance, what we're going to do is we're going to take the sum of x squared times the probability of x. And then we're going to multiply, we're going to take the x squared times the probability of x, and we're going to sum them up. And then we're going to subtract the mean squared. That's why the formula is working. Got it. So now what we just did in the last function, we took x and multiplied it by the probability of x. Now we're going to take a new column that's x squared times the probability of x. And we're going to sum those up to get the first piece of this equation. And then we're going to subtract the answer that we just got, which was -0.8 squared. So to get the other piece of the equation, we're going to start a new function that's x squared times the probability of x. And so if we do that, it's going to equal x squared. So I take what's in here and I square it, and I multiply it by the probability of x. You can see when you click on the formula, it's telling you take the blue box and square it, multiply it by the green box. And if I drag those down, that's the first piece of my equation. But remember, it's x squared times the probability of x, and we want to sum those. So we're going to add these together. That's the first piece. And then we're going to minus the mean squared, which is this value right here, raised to the second. So we're going to take, and that's going to give us 2.66. So our answer here should be 2.66. Okay. Now, when you're not sure how to do it, if you click on the explain will break down the formulas that it's using. So it'll tell you what's happening for each of these. They like to put extra symbols there, but it's each observation times the probability of the observation added up. The expectation of x is also known as the mean. In finance, they call it the expectation. In the rest of the world, we call it the average. But I can't tell you how many professors in finance say, you didn't teach them the expected value. I'm like, I taught them how to take a mean. It's just that the formula changes slightly depending on what type of data you have. So they'll show you step by step where these numbers are coming from, and then they'll do the variance formula. Now their variance formula is much more elaborate than mine because there's actually a cheat. And so the cheat that we did was the formula where we took the expectation, or the sum of x squared times the probability of x, and subtracted the mean squared. Now the reason why we created the Excel sheet, and when you get to higher levels in ALEKS, you're going to want to have an Excel sheet if you're taking time to learn something and you create an Excel sheet to go with it to make sure your formulas are right, then when you have to do the problem 2 or 3 or 4 times, it's very common that most of them will then fill themselves out to go with it. So if I had a new problem on the same subject, right, so I made this Excel sheet, by the way, the only things you're allowed to change are in these 2 boxes, so we'll make those light red. So for this new problem, my outcomes are 0, 10, 20, 30, 40. I don't have anything in this last box, so I just delete it. My probabilities are 0.5, 0.25, 0.05, sorry. 0.25, 0.05, 0.60, and 0.05, and again, I'm deleting this. So just make sure 30, 35, 95, 100, so that works. And then to get the mean and standard deviation, they'll just pop out right here at the bottom. So if you make a formula that says do something, or if I give you a template to do something, once you've done it once, you should be able to then have it for all of the questions that they ask you.